All right, we'll get
We'll
started
get
here with
going.
Ronald's question.
Cool.
In week 6, it says night humidity should be 50%, but the following weeks should be lower. I found out my dehumidifier can only get the room down to 50% at night at 75 degrees. Do I need to adjust anything or just stick to 75 degrees and 50% humidity for the rest of ripening? During lights on, the dehumidifier is fine. Just at night, it struggles. Definitely heard this before.
Yeah, yeah. No, and honestly, if you can get to 50, that's okay. Um, I say 45 just in like the very final week, just to be safe. It's literally just erring on the side of caution. I think if you can keep it down at 50%, that's totally fine. There is oh, and at 75 degrees, that was another thing. As we know, if you raise your temperatures up a little bit, then the moisture holding capacity in the air goes down, and therefore your humidity will drop. So you could raise your temperature up. I wouldn't though, because I think 50% is you're gonna be okay at that point, as long as it's not like crazy swings up and down and you can kind of hold it semi-flat at 50%, that would be just fine. But yeah, I wouldn't go down any lower. So like in the final week of ripening, I think I say I go down to like 72, 73 degrees at night and then try to get that humidity down. But there is, like I said, that caveat where it says if you can't get your humidity down far enough because of inadequate dehumidification, you can raise your nighttime temperatures up to kind of help with that. But it does come at a trade-off. The hotter your room goes in late flower, the more terpenes can be volatilized off. So I think if you can get it, if you can keep it at 50, at 75, I would run that the rest of the way. I don't think you're going to run into any major issues with that at all. Now, if it was up at 60 plus, or swinging 10% at that range, that's more dangerous in my opinion. But if you can keep it pretty stable at those two parameters, I think you're good to go.
Do
So,
you think it's maybe even worth it to like in the last hour's day try and like crush the humidity so that it might, because if he's able to hold it statically, if he could force it down, it might be able to like hold a lower threshold.
you can try. I mean, people do that. They'll like try to like hammer it down half hour before lights off just to kind of,
Yeah,
because there's always a massive spike of humidity right as the lights go out. And it
correct.
can definitely help. You're still going to have the spike no matter what. It's just if
100%.
you make your start point lower, the spike's peak is going to be lower as well, usually. So it doesn't help long term though, typically. Unless of course you've got a scenario, because there's like two different ways that that can really happen, or based on the equipment and the sizing and everything in the room, is you either have a really sharp spike and then it drops down pretty quick as because you've got adequate, equipment, and then it can kind of hold it flat, or it's going to be a sharp spike and then it's going to look like this, where it's just like a slow gradual, takes 6 hours to get you down to the level you're going to be. So if you're in one of the cases where you see that on your graphs where it spikes and then it's like a really gradual decline over half of the night, then yeah, I would absolutely try to hammer it as much as you can right before lights off. Usually 15 to 20 minutes is enough of cranking the dehues to get it down pretty low. And then that will lower that peak spike right after lights off so that when you
Yeah,
go through your gradual decline, it's going to get there half the speed or twice as fast,
twice
actually.
as fast. Yeah.
So if you have the equipment in there and it's able to get up and get down, well, I don't think you're really going to be running into this problem anyway. So yeah, I think
Is there
you
any adjustment to his feed strategy too that he could potentially make? Obviously, if he's doing night shots, that can obviously be
Yeah,
an issue.
you shouldn't really be doing a whole lot of night shots at ripening stage at the end of flower.
No.
Um, but yeah, if you were, I mean, even still, night shots are, unless you're just pumping them out all night, usually a couple of night shots towards the end of lights on or lights off is usually not going to make major effects. Most of the problem that we have with humidity spiking is going to be in the first part of the night, not the second part. And usually when we give night shots, it's because, we drive back and then we hit our target halfway through the night. So that shouldn't cause much of an issue. And usually you can see that. So you would be able to look at your humidity and then you can just overlay your valve data with your humidity data. And then you can see like, oh, shot was given right here. And you have a little tiny, 1 or 2% spike that'll happen. And then the D usually bring it back down. Um, it doesn't usually affect it too much. It's not like a typical irrigation event where you're feeding, you're pushing an X amount of volume through, you've got a lot of runoff happening, and it's just you've got water in the trays, you've got water draining, it's like water is going into the room at that point. When we give those night shots, it's usually just sensor trigger. So it's just a small micro shot as needed. So
Yeah,
usually there's no runoff that occurs with those. So, and it's not usually saturating the substrate enough where you're going to have a bunch of evaporation either. It's just going to be just enough
sure, sure, sure,
that the
sure.
plant's going to uptake, which it does move moisture through the plant and transpire, but
Yeah,
usually not enough to cause a huge issue there.
cool. Yeah, Ronald. Either just keep holding because it's probably good, or you can try a couple of those little tricks to manipulate it in the room.
hmm like I said, I wouldn't panic though at
Yeah.
50% tonight. So, and big issue, late flower. I guess one more thing to add on to that, which we've already kind of talked about, is a big issue. One of the biggest, the biggest reasons that we do add, or we do try to bring that moisture content down is botrytis, the bud rot in there. And bud rot doesn't like warm temperatures. So in the event of trying to solve the high humidity, issue that you might have, raising the temps would inadvertently help deter the bud rot anyway. So I think where you're at is like a perfect median there at 75 and 50. So maybe next run though, you add another DHU in. And or maybe you don't. If you run through it like this and you're just fine and you don't have any issues, there's like I said, what I have is a guideline of a rough guideline. It's a safe guideline when it comes to environmental parameters, especially at night, because I do run such high humidity during the day. I do like to be extra safe at night. There's people who run 60% humidity all the way through to the end, and can be fine. I just to be safe, I usually am like 50 is my max for the last half of flower, and sometimes we'll even get down to 45 if we can. So just
Awesome.
safety. Cool. Is there any more, or should we get going or
I
pick
think
up a
we can. Let's see here. Oh, he said, "Cool. Following the guide, I have the biggest buds I've ever grown. I got to protect them." That's awesome,
definitely.
Ron.
There's nothing more disheartening than growing the fattest nugs and then losing them. So,
Yeah,
There's
I'll tell you.
always the fattest ones too.
yeah, always lose the tops.
You know,
So,
But I'm
cool.
glad the guide's working for you, man. So yeah, sounds like you're in a good holding pattern for right now. Awesome. Yeah, if nobody else has anything right now, we'll go ahead and jump into the guide.
Can you guys see that?
Yes, sir.
I'll zoom in a little bit. There we go. Uh-huh. All right. So this is where I think we left off. We were talking, this is in the weeks 1 through 3 irrigation strategy. And what I was describing is like using that field capacity lock, which, we talked about where to get to that advanced options and how to set that. Basically using that field capacity lock, which creates this orange line right here, if you can see my mouse. And it basically can cut your fuel capacity temporarily down. So even though your timers are set to go all the way up to, the 60% up here, you've entered a fuel capacity lock, let's say at 45%, and it's just cut that thing right in half. Or I think this was 65 up here. And conversely, and we had talked about um, the different states at which you would adjust that and how intense it would be. I was saying what I like to do is I like to match what the plant is currently drying back. So if I've got a young plant in there in week 1 and it can only drink 10% in a night, so like say I gave so say like from the time that I do my last irrigation to the time to that same exact time the next day, if it only drank 10% dried back, then I know that's what I'm going to match my field capacity lock to. So we do that by taking our actual field capacity we subtract down the dry back we want to find our minimum floor, this red bottom floor here. So if it was, 60%, I wanted a 30% dry back. That's going to make my bottom floor 30. And then if my plant is drinking 10% each day, that means my window that I'm going to try to go is to go from 30 to 40%. So I guarantee that I'm not going to go too dry, but I am not giving it any more water than what it absolutely is going to use. There's no excess there. This is going to prevent runoff because we're way outside of the runoff zone, and it's also going to allow me, which allows you to stack EC, and it's also this remaining volume of substrate right here. This could have we could have put in an extra 20% moisture, relative moisture into that block. It's now filled with air. There's nothing in, there's no water in there. So now the roots have access to plenty of air, plenty of oxygen, and it's going to allow them to search more aggressively for more water instead of sitting in water and dampening off. So, and like I said, I match this. So if it's 10% week one, I'll run it like this. And usually every day or two, running the strategy, not only are the roots naturally growing quickly during that time anyway, during stretch, but also if I run it like this, they grow exponentially faster, I found. So it's not uncommon for me in a week to, grow it quite a bit, 2% every other day or something like that, to where it's like, all right, maybe day one, it's 10. Day three, day four, it's at 12. Day five, six, it's at, 13, 14, and it just keeps growing. And I can basically adjust this fail-safe value right here in the advanced settings to match whatever my overnight dryback currently is. So in this example here, my overnight dryback would be 20% in that day, and that's what I would set it to, where my window would be minimum floor of 30, maximum of 50. We're still outside of the runoff range, which means we are still not going to push runoff, and it's going to allow me to give irrigations fresh each day. I know the plant's going to be able to use all of that drink and get me right back down to my 30% floor, where I can then do it again the next day. Um, so yeah, I think I went over that. That was just a little recap from the previous day. And then going into night shots here, it's like what happens if the overnight fail-safe, what happens if overnight fail-safe shots occur during the night? So in the event that we've locked this field capacity here, say, because I also have on here like a default where it's like, even if you got a plant that could drink 30%, right? Say you had you had a 4 to 5 week veg or something, and you got a big plant in its final home, and it could, if it really wanted to, drink. If you let it go all the way up to 60, it could drink all the way down to 30 with a full 30% absolute dryback in one day. Even in that case, if I wanted to stack EC quickly, I would still use this locked field capacity. I would still cut it short of where that runoff zone is right here. I still want to make sure that I'm not going to ever get close to where that's at, because that's when runoff's going to occur. And by running it like this and cutting it off before that ever happens, I'm going to guarantee I'm not pushing runoff, and therefore I'm going to stack EC quick or a lot faster. But if I have a plant that can drink this full 30% and I'm only giving it 15, I am going to hit my minimum floor sometime in the night. And that's where the overnight failsafe comes in. I mean, that's not its use, like that's not why we designed it, but it is something that we can use not just as a failsafe, but also as like part of a strategy when doing this. This is going to allow us to stay in this bottom half of the substrate's water holding capacity. So we're still, I don't think there's markings on this here, but we're still within 30 to 45% right here. And so I'm staying in that dryness window of a 15% right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and basically defer these P1 shots that I normally would be giving here. I'm going to give them over here towards the end of the night as needed. And so where these shots are going to be volume based because it's on a preset schedule for timers, like a 2 minute shot or whatever every 30 minutes for 6 times right here. Instead, I'm going to be giving these on a sensor trigger shot. So it's only going to get irrigate. Maybe it's 30 seconds, maybe it's a minute, whatever it happens to be for it to satisfy what that sensor trigger is. So it's going to hold it at a much flatter line and give much less water. during this time than it would up here. But it's going to still do the same job of holding it at that bottom floor so that the next day we start exactly where we want to start, just like it would in any other scenario that you're using the sensor trigger. So that's I tell people don't panic, if you end up on these fail-safe shots, especially while trying to stack EC in the first, couple weeks. I have done runs, and so have a bunch of other people where we pushed it really hard, and we started giving our overnight shots literally right at lights off. Like we had hit our minimum floor right here, and we were giving night shots all night long. Sometimes there'd be 8, sometimes there'd be 10, small shots, but there'd still be frequent shots happening throughout the night. And the plants would come in every day. The next day, the plants were praying in the morning. They were very happy. And honestly, we've hit really good numbers doing that. So it's like, I don't feel that there is I don't think that there's a problem giving irrigations at night as long as they're not just soaking the plant and over irrigating. You're just giving slight micro shots to keep the plant at that minimum floor so that you don't cause excess stress from drought. I've never seen anything negative happen when doing it this way. So if you end up giving fail-safe shots, I do say it's probably somewhere in here. Don't panic. Um, if you have a problem with that, I would please let me know, and then I can change my mind. But like I have never seen it happen where there's been a problem when doing it correctly. Um, but yeah, since we're trying to stack EC by not pushing runoff, any irrigation events that occur this far. Oh yeah, that was the other reason, which I already talked about. Another point of this is like, as we know, when we get irrigations up close to this runoff zone up here at field capacity, which I think I already kind of covered this, so sorry for if it's a little redundant, but any irrigations that are given up here, um, that's what's going to cause that. It's going to cause runoff to occur and therefore lower our EC down. So that's the reason we move those shots down here, because when you give a shot down here, even if we gave the exact same volume that we gave up here, which we don't, but even if we did, it's very far away from the runoff zone. So any shots given at night poses zero risk of pushing runoff. So, um, what do we got here? Okay, yeah, this little tidbit right here, this disable P2 timer lock. I just threw this in here right here. During the time that you are running in weeks 1 through 3, if you were going to be running this field capacity lock strategy to stack EC, you gotta use this disable P2 timer, because in this scenario, I think we've already kind of gone over this in the past. If a program sees night shots, it doesn't care that it doesn't know why you're doing this. It just knows that you were giving night shots. And so what it's going to try to do is it's going to try to put P2s in to extend your irrigation in time so that these don't occur. So by locking this disable P2, which we have discussed earlier in the guide, going through all that, this is a prime example and strategy of when I would use that. And pretty much mainly the only time I would use that is during this time right here. So as long as this is locked, which you get to it through right here in the advanced settings, there's this disable P2 timer right here under advanced options. As long as you got that checked, the program will let you do this and it will work with you, and it's not going to try to fight you. It's going to say, all right, at no point are we going to change anything. We're just going to keep giving night shots as you need. And that will occur until you remove this fuel capacity lock. Once you get rid of it, you're not going to need these night shots anymore. So yeah, for the first 3 weeks, I always keep this disable P2 timer locked. I never want to add P2s during the first 3 weeks. I would rather give a flush right after the last, if I absolutely needed to, bring my EC down or something, I'd rather give a flush right at the end of my P1s, dry back, and then give fail-safe shots overnight before I'll give a P2. And again, the main reason for that is because I do believe that the generative stress, the majority of the generative stress comes from the total duration of uninterrupted time during the daylight when it's photosynthesizing, where it's not receiving water. So anything that breaks that up, to me, is going to negatively impact what we're trying to get, the responses we're trying to get from the plant by doing this whole thing here. So yeah, I do have this note here. The strategy is not meant to be used for long periods of time. Really, you're only turning it on in the beginning and to stack your EC up as quick as you can so that you can go back to a typical feed, like, where we give our P1s and we hit our dry back while holding the peak EC. Because otherwise, if you ran this, like this right here is like our typical, generative strategy, for weeks 1 through 3, where we give a bunch of P1s, we get up to field capacity, and then we dry back 30%, whatever, or however much percent you want, but usually it's around that 30% absolute range or 50% relative, whatever that happens to be for you. Um, but if you did it like this, you're still going to push runoff typically because we're in this runoff zone right here. So if you did this full strategy right here and got up to field capacity, you should expect to get around at least 10% runoff. And while that's not that much runoff, compared to what you're putting in, it is still runoff. So like if I ran this for weeks 1 through 3 straight, just like this, which I've done quite a bit, you will stack EC slowly. It just usually you're not going to get to the level that you want to get to until you're pretty much at the end of stretch. It usually takes like a full 3 weeks to get to the EC you want to get to, running it like this while still giving a little bit of runoff each day. So to me, from what I understand, the two things that we've gone over that really kind of gives us that generative stress cues is going to be drought and it's going to be EC, increased EC in the root zone. And so the drought thing is easy. Like we can definitely accomplish that quickly and we're going to get the benefit of that quickly. But the EC thing, most of the time, we don't actually get up to levels that are like stressing the plant with high EC up until the very end of stretch. So it's like maybe, day 18, we finally get to that point where we get a little burnt tip. And it's like, okay, well, we finally got there. Now we've got what, 3 more days before it's time to flush it out. We don't really get to sit in that for a long period of time to get the full effects. So that's why I like to try to get to that EC as fast as possible in the very beginning and then hold it there for the entire duration of stretch, and then I can go through and work on my dry backs the rest of the time. So that's why I start it the way I do. Um, but yeah, with that said, I don't do this strategy the whole stretch. Like I have done it and it actually didn't work too terribly. But it's usually the only time that it takes, that it would take 2+ weeks for you to hit your EC target when running this type of irrigation is if you are using a phosphate heavy nutrient. Blended, drip, a couple other jacks, a couple others out there that they're just a phosphate to sulfate heavy nutrient when it comes to ratio, and therefore they do not stack as quickly, or if they do, it just doesn't show up on the sensors or in the runoff. I don't know. It takes a while to stack when you're using those compared to if you're using like Athena Pro or HGV or something where it is sulfate heavy and therefore it does build up extra quick. So this strategy here it was used and developed with sulfate heavy nutrients in mind, but you can still run it with phosphate heavy. It's just expect to run this a lot longer. But even still, you got to do so with discretion, and there are a couple other things that we do. Like for example, when I did run it with a phosphate heavy nutrient, I had to do it for 18 days without pushing a drop of runoff before I finally started seeing, before I got to the level of tip burn that I was looking for, really. And during that time, I had other issues pop up. You don't push runoff for 18 days, you're going to have a problem in some way or another. In my case, I had yellowing on the leaves, lightning of the lightning of the green on the leaves, and so there could be many, many things that cause that. From what I was thinking, I was like, well, I am stacking EC in there. I haven't pushed runoff. There is probably a chance that my pH has dropped a bit, probably out of the range at which I'm going to absorb nitrogen as much, because to me it kind of looked like that. It was full of all the way day or day 7 and full. And it did help correct that. And then when we finally did take runoff at day 18, I came out about 5.8. So that was a theory. I don't know that that's 100% what happened there. I've also heard that You can get lightening of leaves, dry back, not, just in general stress them a little bit too hard generatively that can occur. It could also be from plants prioritizing different nutrients, based on, whatever the stress levels are going on there. So like I don't know that 100%, but I did want to include that in there that with my experience when I had to run this with a phosphate heavy nutrient. With that said, that run, plants did fantastic and we hit great numbers. So even though it took us 18 days to stack and it was weird, um, it was also hard to flush it out. I will say that too, because it seems with the phosphate heavy nutrients, when you get them built up in high ECs like that, even though it takes longer, it also takes longer to bring them back down. So you're definitely going to want to do some major hand watering and flushing to kind of correct that, or else the burn will continue throughout the rest of bulk of flower. And then come week 7 and 8, you're not going to really be able to push too high of an EC and do a real hard generative steer because you'll cook your leaves at that point. Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent, but that was kind of what was going on here with that.
Hey,
Yeah.
that's a good stopping point to answer a question from Vinny.
Mhm.
He says, I'm about to finish setting up my Grow Link. This would probably be more a question for me and Ray. I had a question on the batch tank level sensor. Will this device help trigger my RO system to kick on and fill the reservoir? If so, do I have to hook up a solenoid and connect to the valve link? Just curious how this works more in depth. So when triggering your RO system, so typically your RO system should work off of its own reservoir float valve. Now we can obviously control a inlet valve to the RO tank and basically use a sensor trigger to, open your RO tank and then start, the RO water filling that tank. Typically, though, that's all handled by the RO system itself. It's usually good to just have it as a closed system with just a float valve. You absolutely can do that, though. So,
Mm.
my suggestion is keeping that all in the RO system. However, if you want to monitor the RO system by putting a level sensor in there so that that is being read on your growing system and keeping an eye on it, definitely something that you can do. I don't know, Ray, do you have any other guidance for him there?
Usually if it's a smaller, like a quarter inch RO system or something like that, you can just put the float valve on the end of the tube. But if you're using like a big commercial RO system, those control boards that run those are typically, it's a dry contact input.
Yep.
So what you'll want to do is get like a tethered float switch instead of a static float switch. So you can set a high and a low point. So that way, if you get like a static level switch, it just maintains that one level all the time. But if you get a tethered one that can move, then it'll let it drain down a little bit to a level and then trigger it to fill back up. So you just want to wire that tethered float switch to the dry contact input on your RO system more than likely.
Vinny, let us know if you have any more questions there. And then, Mo, yes, there is a recording of this on our YouTube page. I think it's 24 hours after the recording. It should be up there. Cool. That was it, Marcus. You can go ahead and soldier on, buddy.
Okay. So yeah, I kind of went off on a tangent on that, but basically what I was getting at is, I guess the next part here is once you run this strategy right here to stack your EC. It's not meant to be used apart from the one, depending if you're using the phosphate heavy nutrients, sometimes it can go a little longer, but typically we're not trying to do this the whole time. Usually a week, sometimes a week and a half, sometimes as quick as 4 to 7 days. Really just depends on what you see and what you're on really the level that your plant can get to. Because some plants that threshold in which they're going to start burning is going to be significantly less or more than others. But once you do get to that point where you're like, all right, my plant tips are starting to turn white, we start to see a little bit of leaf tip burn going on. That's the plant telling us that we need to back it off. It's too much for it. And so that's really, really simple. You don't ever have to change anything with your actual P1 timers. You just turn off that. I'm not going to go all the way back up. You just uncheck the fuel capacity lock option under the advanced settings. And when you do that, your regular P1 timers that are still set that you never really had to touch when you enabled it are going to kick back in. And you're going to see that yellow line that was cutting it in half disappear, and it's going to re-add those shots back in and bring you back up to your fuel capacity. And so what I have here is I've like highlighted those last couple shots that are going to get added in, and those are the ones that are in that runoff zone that are now going to start pushing a little bit of runoff. So like I said, once desired substrate EC is reached, you could disable the fuel capacity lock, which is going to raise your target back to the original value, allowing for just enough runoff during the last few P1 shots to help stabilize the EC and keep it from climbing higher. So that's the point of this is like we're expecting these final couple shots here and that 10% or so runoff that's going to accompany them to start introducing enough runoff to bring to not we're not trying to bring the EC down because that's not 10% is probably not going to bring your EC down at all at this point. But what we are hoping for is that it stops the climb. We want to basically put a ceiling on the EC, or it's like the plant has told us this is the level we want that it is comfortable getting to. And we want to make sure that it doesn't go past that. We want to make sure that we're now going to use runoff as our tool to stop the EC from rising and even potentially bring it down ever so slightly to protect the plants at that point. And that is the lever you're going to pull from here on out is we need that EC down or stabilized. We're probably going to need to add a little bit more runoff at that point because that's how we're going to do so. Um, Typically the P1s are going to be enough. You can always add a little flush timer in, which is just a programmable P1 that happens right at the end of your P1s too. So this is when you do this, this is also going to free up the full 30% dryback window, which is going to eliminate the need for more night shots. So in the event that we were giving night shots here, you know, because we cut it off right here, we had cut off 15% of our total dryback window by using that fuel capacity lock and knocking it in half right here. So when we remove that and we allow irrigations to go all the way back up to the full fuel capacity, we're now opening this full window here for like hitting that full 30% dryback. So we shouldn't need those night shots anymore. There are going to be cases where you dry back the full 30% at this point and you still need night shots, but again, those are just one-offs. For the most part, you should be pretty on par or even actually slightly under where you have to wait, a little bit because you didn't quite dry back a full 30% by this point. So yeah, thanks to the fuel capacity lock, there's no need to edit your P1s at all during this entire process. And simply unlocking it will reset your irrigation strategy back to its original configuration, allowing you to continue throughout the remainder stretch with your peak EC held the whole way through. So the whole point of this is like, this can be, if you try to do this without this program, this is a nightmare to do. Like to be, you're going to have to make a lot of adjustments to timers. You're going to have to really be paying attention. You're definitely going to have some form of sensor trigger in place. The whole thing can become a real pain in the ass to do. And honestly, I would never recommend this strategy if I did not have a Copilot program to help me do this stuff. Um, so the beautiful thing of this and why we designed it that way is like with a few clicks, like just literally enabling and disabling a feature, you never have to change your timers, you never have to mess with anything, and you can accomplish all of this safely. Where it's like for a fact you're not going above a certain point, you're not going to go below a certain point, and then to undo all of that and go back to this regular strategy, it's just one checkbox, and nothing has been changed. We never adjusted timers. Um, One note here is when the fuel capacity lock is enabled, so like under the advanced settings, when you enable it and enter that number in, your target EC is overridden temporarily until the fuel capacity lock is disabled again. Um, so if you, under the targets tab, if you were using the fuel or the EC target value there and you didn't have the little checkbox next to it selected that says ignore target EC, um, it will automatically ignore the target EC there while this is happening because it knows that you're manually coming in and taking over and doing this stuff aggressively, so it can't compete with that. You have full control at that point, so just know your target EC is no longer going to work while field capacity lock is enabled. As soon as you unenable field capacity lock, it goes back to working again. But it is worth noting that autopilot will enact this exact same strategy to raise your substrate EC if only target EC is used without locking field capacity. It's just at a much more gradual rate. Like I said, we're not doing anything crazy here. This is exactly how the program operates on the back end. It just does so very slow, methodical, and safe to not cause any type of, problems. Um, I like to be more fast and aggressive. I know exactly what it is I'm trying to do. And let's face it, we're on a time crunch. Every day counts in flower. So if I have the option to get the results I'm looking for in a matter of days versus weeks, I'm going to go for that instead. Um, yeah, so that's it for weeks 1 through 3. And that's the hardest point in the entire run for in terms of controls, in terms of strategy, in terms of pretty much fucking everything, is making sure we have a successful generative a successful generative steer in the first 3 weeks during stretch to ensure that we have set the stage for, massive yields essentially throughout the remainder of flower. That's when you're doing all your deleafing. That's when you're doing all your training. That's when you're doing everything is getting set properly for the remainder of the run. After week 3, and we go back to a vegetative steer, it's almost kind of set and forget compared to weeks 1 through 3. And running any other program, running any other software, trying to do everything we just did there, like I said, it would be a nightmare that I wouldn't recommend. So that is why I always push Copilot is like, man, the hardest part of the grow can be done that easily with a few clicks of a button using this program.
I got a couple of questions if that's a good stopping point, buddy.
Yep.
All right. Mike asks, thank you so much for this Zoom session. I really appreciate the time and effort. I have a quick question. I'll soon be using FloraFlex quick fill bags, 1 gallon size as my grow medium. If I use Netafim drippers, how many drippers per bag would you recommend? And what flow rate in liters per hour would be best?
What did he say? What size the bags are they? The 1 gallon?
1 gallon.
Yeah. 1 gallon quick fill. I like to do slow and steady. I would rather run an extended feed, a 3-minute feed versus at a slower flow rate versus a shorter feed at a higher flow rate because it gives the substrate more time to like take that water on, wick it, and move it, equally saturate everything inside of there versus it just kind of flooding with a little too much and coming out of the bottom through channeling. So I always recommend 2.3 gallon per hour, which what is that liter per hour? 4 liters in a gallon. So shit, I'm not good at math. The Netafim, the brown Netafim 0.3 gallon per hours are the ones that I use. I use 2 of those, sometimes 3 if I find that I'm having really, really long feed times, but usually that's not the case. I would never use higher than a 0.5 gallon per hour, which is a 2 liter per hour emitter, I think. Yeah. So
So yeah, 0.3 gallons is 1.1 liters.
okay. So then yeah, I usually would use two 1.1 liter emitters. And I use that for all Rockwool and all cocoa. Unless the cocoa the bigger the pot size gets and the larger that volume gets, that's when I'll step up those substrate or those emitter sizes. But usually the what would you say, 1.1? Yeah,
1.1.
usually the 1.1 liter or the 0.3 gallon per hour Netafims are my go-tos. You can always add a third in if you really wanted to. Uh, But yeah, I never would exceed more than two half-gallon or 2 liter per hour emitters
Cool.
for that scenario.
Cool. And then next question. He says he has a question about pump and valve timing. So I'm running Netafim drippers with two separate irrigation zones. Each has its own motorized valve, not a solenoid, with separate metering for each zone. I assume substrate monitoring. When an irrigation interval ends, the pump seems to stop faster than the motorized valve fully closes. Yes. Would it be advisable to add a short pump run delay before it shuts off, or is that unnecessary? I'd rather not run the pump continuously since that would increase both the risk of leak and the potential damage if it did not occur. So for this, you're basically your pump is stopping before your valve closes, which isn't a problem. It actually makes it so like it's easier for the valve to close because it's not overcoming like any pressure. That being said, you are going to have a cavity between your valve and your pump because it's a potential cavity. Because it's closing slowly, the water is still potentially like leaking out of it. That's not a problem necessarily. You just kind of will have a kind of an initial rush of water through that kind of open air, which depending on what your flow rate, if this is coming from like just a batch tank of pre-made nutrient, that doesn't matter at all. If this is coming from some sort of like automated dosing system, like a Netafim or like one of ours, usually those are set to like a flow rate range. And so sometimes that can spike the flow rate momentarily, which might give a slightly inconsistent recipe for a moment. But it kind of depends on how long the pipe run is. Like if this was a very long pipe run from, one end of a facility to the other, like 100 feet or something like that, I might be like, yeah, you should figure out how to get rid of that. But if we're talking about tiny runs, then I wouldn't be worried about it at all. And to your point, though, if you wanted to put your pump on basically a delay for stopping, um, what you could do is you should the only way the best way to do that would be to put a pressure switch on the pump rather than like a delay relay or anything like that. That way the pump just runs until the pressure builds to a point where it would kick the switch off. And this is how typical irrigation setups run. So if you were wanting to automate this so that the pump stopped at the basically the exact time that the valve closed, then I would just put a pressure switch on your pump for the runs, and then that would eliminate that. But trying to put like a delay relay on it, it might get a little complicated, and it's probably not going to do what you want it to do ultimately. So that's
Yeah.
that's what I would do. I don't know if the guys have anything actually want to add to that.
Yeah, like you said, the motorized ball valves, like they're usually closed within like 5 seconds.
Yeah,
So I wouldn't worry about that one bit. Sorry.
yeah,
Definitely not worth doing anything about, in my opinion.
yeah, exactly. Like if it's really bothering you, use a pressure switch, or if there was really long run and it was affecting your recipe quality because of that flow rate spike, that's the only thing that I would be like, okay, well maybe you need to fix that. But
It's
if
5 seconds, yeah.
I think it's probably fine though. But yeah, Mike, let us know if you got any other follow up. You said thanks, you got it, buddy. Um, cool. Those were the only two, buddy. We can keep rolling.
Okay. So yeah, everything up here on weeks 4 through 6, which we call bulk. This is where the plants have already set their bud set, with their pre-flowers, and we're gonna swell them and grow them now. So I this is all taken from the chart that was on the very beginning of this entire section. So it's nothing new. We've already gone over all this stuff here. But basically, once stretch is done, we're going to move back to vegetative steer, which essentially translates to simply adjusting our overnight dryback and our EC targets. So I don't change anything with my P1s. Like they don't change at all. It's the exact same as they were for generative. The only thing that's changing is my overnight dryback and my EC if I'm using my target EC. So instead of having a 30% dryback, I'm now moving to 10 to 15% plus. So we'll go over what that means, what the plus means, which I think I already have, but we'll hit it again. So let's see. During bulk, we use P2s to extend the irrigation in time all the way up until lights off, and then we allow the substrate to dry back as much as it can during the lights off period. So this sentence right here. This is a very big deal. It's kind of like the only change that is made. Like my P1s are the same. All we're doing here essentially is saying for a vegetative steer in week 4, I am going to use my P2s, these shots during the day to maintain my field capacity. They're primarily being used to control what my irrigation in time is and therefore control what my dryback is. So what I do as just a run-of-the-mill thing, just to keep things nice and simple, is I will push my P2s all the way up till lights off. There's only one scenario where I do not push it up till lights off, and that is if my dryback in this 12-hour nighttime period is less than 10%. So if I look at my VWC value right here at this point where the lights go off, and I take that number and I subtract this number right here. So say this was, I don't know, 50 and this was 40 right here. I would subtract 40 from 50 and I could see that I had a 10% drawback over this 12-hour window. If I do not have at least 10% here, which is honestly really rare, especially if you ran the generative strategy that we just went over, which explodes your roots and makes those things drink, the drinking capacity of them is nuts at that point. But if something happened and you were not able to have a 10% dryback during this 12-hour nighttime period, all you're going to do is you're just going to move your P3, your irrigation end time, your P3 start, you're going to move it back until you can drink 10%. Because every minute of time that you have added to your overnight dryback is going to increase the dryback capacity, even more so when the lights are on. So, like I said, we're using P2s to set what our total dryback is. That's why I will move it back here in this scenario. But otherwise, we're just irrigating up till lights off and letting it ride. Um, and I think I talked about, yeah, I think I go through all that here too. So if running autopilot, it will do this for you. So all you got to do is just set your P3 target dryback under the targets tab to 10%. And the following day, it's going to add P2 shots up until lights off. So what this instruction is for is like we are coming out of a generative steer with a 30% dryback and we're moving into week 4 the next day. If you really wanted to let it get automated, all you got to do is just go in and adjust your P3 target dryback to 10%, and it's going to do all this shit for you. It's gonna run your old strategy. It's gonna say, oh shit, you dried back 30%. And it's gonna say, we're gonna do some math and analyze, your dryback slope rate, and it's gonna add P2s all the way up to lights off. So whatever it's calculated, it thinks you're gonna get 10%. So it'll actually just take care of that, and it will also remove P1s because when you decrease, don't ever forget that your P1s, this amount of moisture volume of water that you need to recover here is always going to match your dry back. Start point, start point here equates to the end point here, and the start point here equates to the end point here. So basically if this was 30% dry back right here, I need to have enough P1s to account for a 30% rise in moisture. If goes down to 10% as a dry back, I don't need as many P1s. I need to remove a lot of those P1s because I only need to rise up 10% to match this. So the program will take care of that for you. Or if you're like me and a control freak, you're going to want to do it yourself. And so that's where Copilot comes in. It's not going to take care of it for you, but it can help you do it as an assistant. So if you're running Copilot, you can manually, instead of waiting a 24-hour period for the program to do all this, I know what I want to do. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to override and I'm going to change up my schedule and my targets and just go ahead and get it as close to where I think it should be as possible. And then I'll let it dial it in from there versus having to make such a major change on its own. So you can manually go in and add P2s up until lights off. It's very easy to do. You just look at the graph up here and say, all right, how many P2s do I need to add? You know what, maybe you start at just a default 3% maintenance dryback, which is pretty fair, as like a standard there. And so it's like, well, how many of those do I need to add mathematically until I get until, my lights off time? And so you can just add them in, and now you're go ahead and you've set the stage exactly where you want to be, to where the next day it's going to give you your P1s, and by doing that, you're also going to you have to look at the graph, right? So if you came in and did this manually and you added a bunch of P2s in, and you changed your dryback to, let's say, 10%, if you still had 11 shots, it's going to give these shots right here. And then right here, it's going to stack a whole bunch of shots because it still shows that, you still have it programmed under your schedule page to have 11 shots, but it's not needed mathematically. So it's up to you if you're going to go in and manually do this to delete those shots out until your graph looks good. I always tell people, like, whenever you're concerned or whatever, you're trying to make adjustments to your timers and schedules, without having Copilot telling you exactly what to do, just pay attention to the graph. It doesn't lie to you. It's going to let you know if something mathematically doesn't make sense. If you're not hitting your fuel capacity, you need to make sure that it's because you didn't want to hit your fuel capacity. So, like, if you only had 3 shots here and it was down here and your fuel capacity was up here, you need to look at that and say, well, why am I not getting up to fuel capacity? Do I need to add more shots? Do I need to check out and adjust what my fuel capacity actually is? What do I need to change to make sure that my graph looks good? As long as you log out of that program with your graph looking exactly as you want it to look, now you're set up for success at that point. If you log out and your graph looks weird as hell, don't expect things to work as you want them to work, because what happens here is really what the program's going to try to make match. Because this is just your target graph. It's trying to make your actual sensor data graph match this. So those are just two ways. Like, you can either let the program do it, or you can come in and manually cut out your P1s, add your P2s in, make it look like this, and then set your target to a 10%, and then let the program tell you, hey, we need to remove a P2, or maybe we need to adjust this, add that, tweak this here and there. And that's what it's really good for. Um, so let's see. Keep the overnight fail-safe value the same. Oh, this is another big thing here. Yeah. Keep the overnight fail-safe value set the exact same as you did during stretch, to allow the plants the opportunity to dry back further if needed without getting fail-safe shots. So a lot of people will, they'll say their overnight dry back, like, minimum threshold, was like that fail safe, the overnight fail safe, sorry, say that was set to 20% because their peak was at 50, they had a 30% dry back, and it was set to 20 as the minimum floor, where they did not want to let it get below that. A lot of what some people might be tempted to do is, when they shift over here and they change their dryback target, and now that maybe they're only getting down, they only did a 10% dryback, now they're only supposed to get down to 40%, right? They would update that overnight failsafe to 40%. That's not a good call. If I were you, I would continue to use the failsafe exactly as you did before, as a failsafe, where it's like, I know what my wilt point is. Let's just say it's 20%. I know my wilt point is, like, I do not want to get below 20%, but I know for a fact that if that plant gets anywhere down or anywhere above 20%, it's going to be okay. And so I would keep that minimum floor as a minimum floor. And that way, if you set your target to 10%, right, with your overnight dryback, and that's a better option. If you set it to 10% and it's going to irrigate all the way up till lights off, and then it dries back, well, if it's going to grow over time, it's not going to stay at 10% the whole weeks 4 through 6. I guarantee you that by week 5, if it's not already there day one, it's probably going to grow, and it's going to say, instead of 10% overnight, it's going to go to 12 to 15. So I've seen them up to literally 30%, where it will literally drink from the start point here to the end point here. I've seen this number very high. And that is just that's giving P2s all day long up until lights off. The plant is just able to crush and drink that much water in a 12-hour nighttime period. It's not a bad thing. That means your plant is moving nutrients through it. And it is operating on a very high level. And so I want to give the plant the ability and the freedom to drink as much as it wants to drink without flooding it with water. I'm flooding it with water during the whole 12-hour lights on period. You know, give it its 12-hour period to oxygenate itself, to dry back, to do the processes that it needs to do and avoid any type of damping off or root zone related issues. So by setting that minimum fail safe well under where I plan to go to, if it decides to drink 3 or 4% more that night than it previously did, you're giving it the freedom to do so. It's basically like a parent, you're allowing your kid to go experience life and get into trouble, but you're always kind of there just in case it gets too extreme. That's what we're doing here. We're allowing the plant to drink what it can drink and what it wants to, but we always have the fail safe down at that bottom so that if it pushes it a little too far, we're not going to have any type of major problems that occur or wilt. Um, and so with that said, you need to, if you really want this to run optimally, all you got to do is just pay attention. And this is the entire strategy for weeks 4 through 6, is just always pay attention to what this dry back level is overnight. We're never changing anything with our P1s. We're never changing anything with our P2s. We're usually maxing them out until lights off. And we're just looking at what this number is. And as it grows, we should go in and update our P3 target. So our overnight dryback target. So if it goes from 10 to say it went from 50 to 40 day one, and then day three, I say day three, day three of week 4, it went to 37%. Well, that tells me I now dried back 13% overnight, right? So now I can go in and update that. And when I update that now, the program will say, oh, you added an extra 3% here, which means we need to add an extra 3% over here to keep things even. And it's going to go ahead and do that for you or tell you that you need to do that. Or you can do it yourself. Yeah, all of these things can happen, but what matters is that you do the thing. So if this gets increased, which it will over that course of 2 weeks, this or 3 weeks, sorry, this also needs to match. And so if at some point you end up at 20% overnight, you need to make sure that you got enough P1s over here to get you back up 20%, right? And this is the cycle that you follow. We irrigate during the day, we give our same P1 sequence that we did before, and we give them P2s throughout the day to keep them nice and saturated, and push, typically around 20 to 30% runoff throughout the whole day. And then we just let the plant tell us how much does it want to drink overnight, and we let that happen. Um, it's not uncommon for the nighttime drybacks to exceed 15%. If you find that your plants are drying back more than 30% in this 12-hour window here, um, it's not a bad thing, but it is usually a sign that you either need to decrease your veg time because you got too big of plants going in, or you need to increase your substrate volume. You're using too small of a pot. So it's basically in both scenarios, the plant is too big for the substrate at that point. Um, so that's a sign that you can fix the next run because you're like, hey, I already know how this is going to go. But by irrigating up until field capacity right here, and then pushing P2s throughout the entire lights on period, um, adequate runoff should occur, that 20-30% runoff should occur to stabilize your EC down to slightly above your input feed EC. So if you're feeding at a 3 EC still this whole way, we should be chilling between 3 and 4 EC at peak saturation here. We might bounce up to 5 or so at peak drought right around here. So that's usually where we want to hold it through weeks 4 through 6. If we already looked at how we adjust EC gradually with the sizings of our P2s. This is where you're going to pull that strategy that we talked about earlier, or you pull that strategy. This is where you're going to pull it into a real application and how you're going to use that. So if you need to increase or decrease your P2, if you need to change that EC up or down, you either need to increase or decrease your P2 target maintenance dryback during this time so that you can either give a bunch of small, tiny shots and increase your runoff amount and gradually bring your EC down, or give fewer and far, make this P2 targets larger, and then you're going to end up giving less shots throughout the daytime period and therefore pushing less runoff and therefore slowly increasing your EC up. So that's it for weeks 4 through 6. So like I said, it's whole strategy that we looked at, weeks 1 through 3, it's really just a couple clicks of the button and paying attention to what's happening with the plants, turning those features on and off. And then when it comes to weeks 4 through 6, we're just irrigating till lights off and we're paying attention to what our overnight drybacks are and adjusting it accordingly to there. It's really doesn't get any more complicated than that in practice. And the more you do it, the easier this is going to become. So I think we're at a stopping point. So I'm not going to go into 7 and 8 right now.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Appreciate you, Marcus.
Yep. So,
Yeah, appreciate it, man.
cool.
We appreciate everybody showing up. Thanks for the questions today. I hope we answered your questions. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Good luck growing this week. And yep, see you next time.
Yep. Take care.